Well, thank you all very much for being here. As you probably noticed, somebody has picked up the United States and turned it upside down. So it's 70 in Pennsylvania, 50 in Wisconsin, and we're living in Minnesota suddenly. It's a very strange day. Welcome to our symposium that is called Reimagining Global Christian History, Fresh Insights. And this will have two halves, which I'll describe in a moment. My name is Philip Jenkins. With my colleague Tommy Kidd, I direct a project in historical studies of religion. The great thing about that is we can organize interesting events and conversations and get some very good speakers to visit. And we figured this was a very important topic right now. We're living at a very important time in terms of a shift in Christian numbers worldwide. There are far more Christians in some parts of the world, massive growth in, for instance, Africa and Asia, Latin America. And what we think is, you can look at this in a couple of different ways. You can look at the way things are right now, but it also forces you to rethink the history. Not rewrite in the sense of change what is accurate, but to look at things that you might not have paid attention to in years gone by. So if you look at many histories of Christianity, they're really focused on Europe and then North America, and there's not much else. But what about the history of these other parts of the world, which are often areas with really ancient Christian stories? How different is Christianity when you get it outside Europe and North America? And that's our event for today. In the first part of the talk, we have two presentations. And what I'm going to do is just introduce the speakers very briefly right now, and then I'll get them to go one after the other. First is Anna Redhair, who is a master's student in the history department at Baylor. She works on aspects of women and pilgrimage in the Middle Ages, and she'll be completing her master's degree this coming May. And her topic, let me get this right, is women's roles in the Book of the Saint of the Ethiopian Church. And as she will explain, the Ethiopian Church is a very critical part of the history of Christianity that often we don't pay enough attention to. And our second speaker is Beth Allison Barr, who is a associate professor of history, again at Baylor. She directs the graduate program. She studies aspects of women's history. Her particular focus is in terms of late medieval and early modern history. And where are we? She is currently completing a book on women in English sermons, 1350 to 1500. So I will please ask Anna Redhair to begin and lead us into this great map we have up as a slide. Thank you very much.
I promise I'll get to the map in a moment. So, on the 25th day of the month of Miasia, the Book of the Saints of the Ethiopian Church included a description of the life and martyrdom of Saint Sarah. Sarah married a man named Socrates, who served as the governor of Antioch during the reign of Diocletian, and she bore her husband 2 sons. Socrates denied Christ, but Sarah followed the faith and desired to baptize her children. She boarded a ship bound for Alexandria with her 2 boys, but they encountered a terrible storm. Fearing for the salvation of her young sons, Sarah cut her breast and, using the blood from her wound, made the sign of the cross on their foreheads, hearts, and backs. She then dipped both of them in the sea 3 times. Almost instantly, the storm dissipated, and the family arrived safely in Alexandria. Sarah took her sons to the archbishop, but when he attempted to baptize them, the water congealed on the boys' foreheads and fell off. This happened 3 times, so he questioned Sarah, and she confessed everything she had done on the ship during the storm. After listening to her story, the Archbishop responded, quote, "Fear not, for it is our Lord Jesus Christ who hath baptized thy sons with his own hand when thou didst immerse them in the sea." End quote. The Archbishop recognized Sarah's baptism of her sons as valid and acknowledged how God had rewarded her faith. The story ended with Sarah's martyrdom alongside her two sons at the hands of her husband and the emperor. St. Sarah's story highlighted the power of a woman's faith. She defied the authority of her husband, and the Archbishop upheld her baptism of her sons, even though only those ordained by the Church had the authority to perform such a sacrament. The life and martyrdom of St. Sarah provides merely one example of the positive representations of women in the Book of the Saints of the Ethiopian Church. A late medieval text, the Book of the Saints contains a brief life of each saint to be read as part of the liturgical service. Ethiopian Christianity boasts of a cult of saints including almost 200 indigenous saints and many more from the Bible and the early days of the faith. The Book of the Saints of the Ethiopian Church appears quite similar to the Golden Legend, a medieval compilation of saints' lives that circulated throughout Western Europe. Although the form and time period of these two works closely parallel one another, the content differs, particularly in its treatment of women. By examining the female saints represented in the Book of the Saints of the Ethiopian Church, and another later text, The Life of Walada Petros, I suggest that the distinctive culture of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church provided a greater variety of acceptable roles for Christian women as compared to the examples portrayed in European saints' lives, such as the Golden Legend. A comparative analysis of this kind opens an opportunity to broaden the scholarly understanding of medieval Christianity and provides a means of incorporating Ethiopian Christianity into the wider Christian tradition. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church's unique place in the Christian tradition derived in part from the way Christianity developed within the nation. The ancient kingdom of Aksum, a predecessor to Ethiopia, encountered Judaism through trade, which accounts for the presence of Judaic elements in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church today. Ethiopian Christians continue to practice circumcision on the 8th day, observe the strict dietary restrictions found in Exodus and Leviticus, and emphasize the importance of the law, particularly the Ten Commandments. These Judaic customs set the Ethiopian Orthodox Church apart from the Oriental Orthodox churches, a group of 6 churches that share a rejection of the 5th century Council of Chalcedon. In 451, the Council of Chalcedon crafted a Christology in which Christ had 2 natures, one human and one divine, yet perfectly united. This contradicted the so-called hybrid model put forth by Eutyches, but it also condemned the single nature view held by Christians in Africa. These so-called Monophysites, for their single nature view of Christ, accepted the condemnation of Eutyches, but they continued to follow the teachings of another leader named Dioscorus, who preached that Christ had a single nature. This theological difference caused the Oriental Orthodox churches to split with both the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church of Byzantium. The dual belief in Monophysitism and the practice of Judaic customs in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church marginalized it in the wider scope of Christian historiography and contributed to its isolation from the rest of Christianity in Africa. Likewise, previous scholars of the history of Africa tended to exclude Ethiopia from the narrative because it did not fit within the recognized parameters for the history of the continent. The spoken Ethiopic language gained a written form known as Ge'ez by the 3rd century, although a precise date has not been determined. European scholars who constructed the narratives about African history for a century and a half often used the lack of a written language to identify sub-Saharan African nations and justified their colonization by European powers. The presence of a written language predating that of most European languages, and Ethiopia's resistance to colonialism precluded it from consideration as an African nation. Ethiopia did not conform to the established paradigm for sub-Saharan Africa. Consequently, its achievements were largely ignored in the continent's historiography. Typically, Western Europe and Roman Catholicism dominate research and discussions about medieval Christianity, yet Christianity existed in Ethiopia beginning in the 4th century. King Ezana recognized Christianity as the official religion of the kingdom in the mid-4th century, and the earliest church building dates from this period as well. Beginning in the 8th century, Muslim invasions caused the Ethiopian Orthodox Church to develop in relative isolation from the rest of the Christian world. Scholars know little for certain about Ethiopia's medieval history, but the Book of the Saints of the Ethiopian Church offers a possible source to uncover additional information. The book has a multi-layered composition and provenance, however, making it a difficult source to unravel. The lives contained in the document originated in Greek and Syriac sources, likely from the early church. These texts were later translated into Coptic and then translated again into Arabic. Although some discrepancy exists among the manuscripts known today, internal evidence suggests the bishops compiled these various lives around 1247. The earliest form of the Book of the Saints in Ethiopia simply translated the lives of the Jacobite Church of Egypt from Arabic into Ge'ez, the written form of Ethiopic, and only included the saints venerated by the Egyptian Church. This translation likely took place in the 14th century and coincided with the, quote, golden age and classical period of Ge'ez literature, end quote, which began in the 14th century and extended into the 17th century. As the Book of the Saints of the Ethiopian Church made its way into churches and monasteries, local scribes added the stories of Ethiopian saints and holy men and women to the text. The resulting document included the lives of Greek, Syrian, Coptic, and Ethiopian saints from the earliest years of Christianity up to the recent past. The text began as a reflection of Coptic Christianity, but quickly gained a distinctly Ethiopian viewpoint. The Book of the Saints of the Ethiopian Church and the previously mentioned Golden Legend fall into a category of literature known as hagiography or hagiobiography, which presents unique challenges when attempting to analyze the text from a historical and gendered viewpoint. Hagiographical texts relate stories about the saint and seek to venerate him or her and bring glory to God rather than provide historical facts about the saint's life. The author typically did not have firsthand knowledge of the saint and produced an account that followed a standardized narrative while emphasizing the ideal of sanctity. The eminent 20th century scholar of Ethiopia, Conti Rossini, argued that the usefulness of hagiography could only be determined based on the length of time that had elapsed between the saint's life and the composition of a written record about the saint. Yet scholars know little about when or who wrote Ethiopian hagiography. This attitude towards hagiography caused scholars of Ethiopia to virtually ignore it as a source until recently. In addition to the lack of scholarly research on Ethiopian hagiographical texts, the few scholars who attempted to engage with hagiography examined exclusively male saints, which excluded gender from their analysis. Despite the various difficulties associated with using hagiography as source material, a gendered analysis of the saints' lives in the Book of the Saints sheds additional light on the history of medieval Ethiopia and provides a point of comparison with the construction of gender in European hagiography, such as the Golden Legend. So if you look at the map, what it's displaying for you is kind of the spread of these saints' lives. So most of these saints' lives are originating in the Holy Land, Syria, often kind of the Eastern Mediterranean. And then what we see happen is these saints' lives filter through Egypt and the Coptic Church into Ethiopia, while they're simultaneously also being spread into Europe after the fall of Rome, and we end up with the Golden Legend in Western Europe, and we end up with the Book of the Saints of the Ethiopian Church in Ethiopia. So they're starting with a very similar source base, but they take very different forms, as we'll see in the comparison. The form and use of the Book of the Saints of the Ethiopian Church allowed the text to reach a wide audience. The Book of the Saints venerates over 1,000 saints and holy men and women divided between each day of the year. The Ethiopian year consists of 13 months, but one month is considerably shorter than the rest. The saints' lives vary in length from a few lines to several pages and often incorporate biblical passages to demonstrate a saint's belief in God. The compilers of the Book of the Saints clearly utilized the Old Testament, Gospels, Book of Revelation, beliefs of Egyptian and Coptic Christians, as well as local legends to create the document. Priests typically read the saints' lives for a particular day from the work at the end of every church service, making the stories familiar and available even to those who did not have access to the text itself. This practice alleviated a problem in the late medieval period, as it would have required hundreds of goats or sheep to produce enough pages to create a copy of this text. Only the very wealthy could afford to own a copy of the Book of the Saints of the Ethiopian Church, yet several manuscripts exist in European libraries and Ethiopian monasteries today, demonstrating its significance and importance in medieval Ethiopia. The daily saints' lives presented in the Book of the Saints served as examples of holy living and devout faith to Ethiopian Christians of all classes. Compiled in the 1260s, the Golden Legend's similar time frame, content, and sources allows for a comparative analysis of female hagiography in two vastly different geographic locations. The Dominican Jacobus de Voragine intended for busy priests and preachers to utilize his collection as source material for their sermons. Although not the only collection of saints' lives in existence at the time, the Golden Legend enjoyed widespread popularity, a fact attested to by the more than 1,000 manuscript copies preserved today. Voragine began his entry for a particular saint with an etymology of his or her name, followed by a description of his or her life and recounting of the miracles performed. He drew on a wide variety of sources, including both the Old and New Testaments, patristic authors, and early medieval theologians and historians. Many of the biblical and early Christian saints who appear in the Book of the Saints of the Ethiopian Church also appear in the Golden Legend, thanks to their common source base. The overlap in material and circulation during the late medieval period provides a comparison of the representations of women in these two sources. The Golden Legend presented female saints in a rather one-dimensional role, that of the Holy Virgin. Of the 28 female saints, the text represented 19 of them as virgins. 4 of the women were biblical figures, such as Mary and Mary Magdalene. The Golden Legend presented only 5 women in the role of mother, and one of them, St. Paula, abandoned her children in order to pursue a holy life. The virgins in the text refused to defile themselves and underwent extreme bodily tortures as a result. Several scholars have researched the emphasis on the young female body and the physical tortures it endured as a means of remaining pure in European hagiography. The Golden Legend emphasized virginity as the best option for all Christian women, despite its almost unattainable status for any woman who was not a nun. European hagiography, as exemplified here by the Golden Legend, valued virginity over all other female roles, thereby limiting the ways women could participate in Christianity. An analysis of the stories of female saints and holy women presented in the Book of the Saints of the Ethiopian Church, however, revealed that women occupied a variety of roles that were equally valid and praiseworthy, as opposed to the strict emphasis on virginity found in the Golden Legend. Women taught others about the faith, introduced Christianity to their children, who later became saints, and encouraged others to remain steadfast in the face of persecution. On the 18th day of Kedar, the Book of the Saints commemorated the holy virgins Atrasis and Iona. Atrasis was the daughter of a pagan king who forced her to live in a palace so that she might never see a man. God commanded her in a vision to send for the virgin Iona to teach her about the faith, and Iona instructed her about Adam, creation, Noah, Abraham, the Exodus, the prophets, and Christ, born to save the world. The 2 virgins endured persecution and execution at the hands of Atrasis' father, but did not forsake their faith. Iona possessed a great deal of knowledge about Christianity and used biblical stories to convert another woman. The story presented women as capable of instructing other women in the faith. Another story from the 25th day of Hamle further illustrated the ability of women to teach others about God. 2 saints, Mugi and Thekla, received instruction in the faith from an unnamed woman described as, quote, a God-fearing teaching woman, end quote. Before the governor tortured and executed them, which is the end of most of these stories, the Virgin Mary and Elizabeth appeared to these women to reassure them. Mugi and Thekla's faith merited a visit from 2 biblical women and could be traced back to the instruction of another woman. The faithfulness of Iona and the unnamed woman to teach other women helped spread Christianity and resulted in additional female saints. Women in the Book of the Saints instructed and encouraged not only other women, but men as well. The 6th day of Magabit celebrated the life of Saint Dioscorus, but it credits a woman with convincing him to return to Christianity. The parents of Saint Dioscorus raised him as a Christian, but he later converted to the Muslim faith. When news of his conversion reached his sister, she wrote him a letter saying, quote, "I would rather that news had come to me telling me that thou had died a Christian. Nay, I would have rejoiced therein, than that this news of thee which hath reached me, telling me that thou art not dead, and that thou hast abandoned the faith of Christ thy God." End quote. She threatened to never write or see her brother again if he persisted in his new religion. Her admonishment greatly troubled Dioscorus, so he converted back to the Christian faith and eventually died as a martyr. The sister of St. Dioscorus remained more steadfast in her faith than her brother, and her words convinced him to return to Christianity. This story demonstrated the power found in the words of a woman. In the story of St. George Mazacam on the 19th of Sane, a woman played a significant role again by encouraging a male saint as he faced persecution and death. The wife of the governor torturing St. George Mazacam believed in Christ, and after he had been tortured, she, quote, strengthened him and taught him that he must not think in his heart that the punishment which had come upon him was because of his sins, that Satan should not lead him astray or destroy his toil, and that he must encourage himself in his heart with the thought that he was a counterpart of the martyrs, end quote. The next day, an angel of God appeared to St. George Mazacam and repeated almost the exact same information. The angel's encouragement echoed that of the woman, confirming her words. Women possess the ability to admonish and encourage both men and women with their words. The women depicted in the Book of the Saints of the Ethiopian Church often occupied the role of mother and played an integral part in spreading the faith. The beginning of almost every saint's life named both his or her father and mother, elevating the importance of the mother to an equal status with the father. Furthermore, the mother of a saint often believed in Christianity and experienced persecution alongside her children, while the father typically remained a pagan or Muslim. Only a few of the saints' lives in the Golden Legend acknowledged a saint's parents. On the 7th day of Kadar, the Book of the Saints commemorated Saint Zenobius and his mother, Saint Zenobia, who endured persecution for the faith until their execution. Significantly, the saint's father received no mention. On the 20th of Magabit, the text recounted the martyrdom of a holy woman named Stratonice. Her father was a pagan, but her mother believed in Christ. Her father turned her over to the governor to be tortured and executed, while her mother encouraged her to remain strong in her faith. The Book of the Saints presented a few instances in which mothers resisted Christianity or served as negative examples for their children, but these occurred far less frequently than the positive examples. In most cases, mothers encouraged the faith of their children, and the saints' lives identified the transmission of Christianity to the next generation with women. Women also receive recognition for shaping some of the most celebrated saints and holy men in the Christian tradition. The 28th of Magabit credited St. Helena with raising Constantine as a Christian, although she did not dare to baptize him at the time. Although the rest of the story more or less followed the European account of Constantine's conversion, Helena's instruction first introduced the emperor to the faith and caused him to extend mercy to Christians. The Golden Legend, however, did not mention St. Helena's faith prior to Constantine's conversion, or acknowledge her role in his acceptance of Christianity. In fact, the Golden Legend did not provide an entry for St. Helena, and only discussed her in reference to the discovery of the cross. In the Ethiopian version of the story, however, the faith of the first Christian emperor originated in the words of his mother. Women such as St. Sarah and St. Helena exercised significant influence as mothers in the stories found in the Book of the Saints, and their faith furthered the spread of Christianity. In several instances, the Book of the Saints portrayed women as more steadfast in their faith when compared to men. The 13th day of Mascarum celebrated St. Basil and included the story of a young man who sold his soul to the devil so a beautiful young woman would fall in love with him. The two married, but upon discovering her husband's secret, the young woman insisted he convert to Christianity. St. Basil prayed over the young man and released him from his vow to the devil. In this story, the young man succumbed to the devil's temptation, and the young woman brought him back to the faith through the help of St. Basil. The young woman held on to her faith, while the young man exchanged his to satisfy a lustful desire. The saint's life on the second day of Hamle further illustrated the faith of women in contrast with men. St. Thaddeus traveled to Syria and performed a miracle for a man who offered him something to eat. The nobles of the city wanted to kill him, but decided instead to prevent him from entering the city by placing a naked prostitute at the city gates. Apparently, it was a good form of deterrence. Thaddeus prayed for the archangel Michael to lift her out of the way. Quote, "And when the apostles had come to the gates of the city, she perceived the wickedness of her deed." End quote. Satan had hardened the hearts of the nobles against Thaddeus, but Michael drove the evil spirits away, and the whole city converted to Christianity. Thaddeus then, quote, "appointed the woman who had been suspended in the air to minister in the church," end quote, thereby elevating the prostitute to a position of authority as a result of her faith. The woman recognized her sin and repented before the men of the city did, and Thaddeus chose her to serve in the church. Both the young woman from the story of St. Basil and the naked prostitute in the story of St. Thaddeus displayed greater faith than the men in these stories. The compilers of the Book of the Saints devoted one of the longest accounts in the text to a woman with a very unique story. St. Arwa was an Israelite woman whose husband left on a journey. In his absence, she encountered several men, including her husband's brother, who all tried to sleep with her, but she refused. In retaliation, the last man sold her to a group of men embarking on a ship. The man who bought her also wanted to sleep with her, but a terrible storm engulfed the ship. Arwa declared, quote, "O ye who didst buy me wrongfully, O ye who didst sell me wrongfully, I am not a handmaiden, but a woman who is her own mistress. If ye will do what I tell you, I will pray to God to guide you out of this tribulation." End quote. God heard Arwa's prayer and calmed the sea, but then all the men on the boat lusted after her, and another storm broke the ship apart. Arwa disguised herself as a man and brought a bag of money to the king of the region to be distributed to the families of the victims from the shipwreck. The king became ill and appointed Arwa, who he believed to be a young man, as his successor. She renounced the throne, however, and lived in a cave where she gained a reputation as a healer. At the end of the story, all the men who previously wronged her were afflicted by blindness and came to Arwa for healing. They did not recognize her, but she convinced each of them to confess their sins and then healed them of their blindness. This story gave a great deal of authority to Arwa, who possessed the ability to calm the sea and heal blindness. Her story also seems reminiscent of the story of Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his brother and wrongfully accused by Potiphar's wife, yet rose to a place of prominence and later confronted his brothers. Arwa successfully resisted the advances of every man in the story and ultimately freed herself from the authority of any man. She exercised power and spiritual authority and ended with the strongest faith of anyone. The female saints and holy women represented in the Book of the Saints of the Ethiopian Church possessed greater authority and agency than their European counterparts. In the Golden Legend, women gained access to spiritual power only by remaining virgins or resisting their gender. Several female saints dressed as men, and St. Paula rejected her role as a mother in order to pursue a holy life. The Book of the Saints, however, included scores of virgins, but the text also provided other roles for women. Women often taught or encouraged the faith of both men and women, and in some cases their words received angelic confirmation. Mothers occupied a more visible place in the text and remained faithful to Christianity more frequently than fathers. One mother, St. Sarah, even successfully baptized her own children. The text also portrayed women as more steadfast in their faith than men on multiple occasions. St. Arwa's life represented her as more faithful than all the men in the story, and she exhibited a great deal of power and authority, as well as forgiveness. Although the Book of the Saints did not necessarily hold these women up as examples to be emulated literally, their stories provided a range of valid roles for women within Ethiopian Christianity, aside from simply maintaining one's virginity. The representation of women in a wide range of roles reflected women's involvement in Ethiopian Christianity from the beginning. Tradition credits the Queen of Sheba with connecting Ethiopia and Israel. The first-century historian Josephus and several church fathers, including Origen and Jerome, believed the Queen of Sheba mentioned in the Old Testament was an African queen of Egypt and Ethiopia. She brought Judaism back to her kingdom, laying an early foundation for the acceptance of a monotheistic religion. According to tradition, the Queen of Sheba also conceived a son by Solomon, thereby creating a royal lineage later known as the Solomonic dynasty. The Queen of Sheba received special recognition in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and provided a positive religious representation of a woman. Although the traditions surrounding the Queen of Sheba largely stem from myth, a historic woman, Wolata Petros, played an important role in Ethiopia's resistance against the Portuguese and colonialism. Wolata Petros, which means daughter of Peter, achieved sainthood in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church in the 17th century because she refused to convert to Roman Catholicism. Her hagiography, known as the Life of Wolata Petros, provides the most detailed description of her story and further demonstrates the spiritual authority depicted in Ethiopian female saints' lives. The first Portuguese explorers came to Ethiopia in the late 15th century and assisted the Ethiopians in resisting the advances of Islamic forces. Islamic invasions gave the two Christian kingdoms a common enemy. However, the European religious wars of the 16th century that broke out as a result of the Reformation gave birth to a new group that radically shifted the relationship between the Portuguese and Ethiopians. The Jesuits were concerned with identifying and rooting out heresy in the Roman Catholic Church. By the late 16th century, new groups of Portuguese made up of the recently formed Jesuits landed in Ethiopia with a very different view of the religious beliefs of the kingdom. According to scholar Mateo Salvador, quote, Ethiopians were no longer regarded as brothers in the faith, peers within a shared Christian world, but as heretics to be converted, their country a land of mission, end quote. The Portuguese Jesuits remained bent on converting Ethiopians to Roman Catholicism, but they encountered little success at first. At the beginning of the 17th century, a new king, Susenyos, and his powerful brother, Seleucrestos, both converted privately, but later made their conversions public in 1621. Susenyos allowed the Jesuits to establish churches and translate the Latin liturgy into Ge'ez. The majority of the male elites followed the king and converted to Roman Catholicism, leaving noble women to lead the resistance against the Portuguese incursions. Eventually, Susenyos converted back to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, but died soon after. His son Fasilides remained part of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and Ethiopia forcibly expelled all Jesuits from the country by 1653. The religious and political conflicts between the Portuguese and Ethiopians set the background for the life of Wolata Petros. Born into a noble and wealthy family in 1592, she married Malchia Crestos, an important counselor and military commander, at the age of 16. He converted to Roman Catholicism, but Wolata Petros remained part of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. All three of the couple's children died in infancy, and Wolata Petros eventually became a nun. She began speaking out against the king after he publicly announced his conversion to Roman Catholicism, and was brought to court several times to account for her actions. The king attempted to convert her and then exiled her, but people flocked to Wolata Petros and the monastic communities she established. She died in 1642 on Rima Island after Christ appeared to her and appointed her as an archdeaconess. She performed many miracles during her life and continued to do so posthumously. The narrative presented in the life of Wolata Petros did not conform to the European idea of a female saint. She consistently resisted the male authorities in her life, preached publicly, and successfully led the defense of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church against the Portuguese. Despite her gender, Wolata Petros led the Ethiopian resistance against Roman Catholicism and exhibited power and authority through her words and actions. When she felt an overwhelming desire to protect her faith, she began exhorting the people, quote, not to accept the filthy faith of Leo, and not to mention the name of the apostate king during the liturgy, end quote. She began preaching and teaching, two activities not typically represented in European female hagiography, the one exception, of course, being that of Mary Magdalene. King Susenyos recognized the power of her words and complained to her relatives and said, quote, "With her words she has stripped me of my kingship, rebelled against me, betrayed me, and insulted me as well as my faith. She has subverted the hearts of that town's people so that they don't accept my faith and don't mention my name in the liturgy," end quote. The townspeople followed Wlada Petros' teaching, and her words clearly brought her to the attention of the king. The king blamed her words for disrupting his kingdom, thereby acknowledging her power and authority. Wlada Petros also debated with the Jesuits and resisted their teachings, in spite of intense efforts to convert her. The leader of the Jesuits, Afonso Mendez, taught her the tenets of the Roman Catholic faith from sunrise to sunset every Saturday without ceasing, but achieved nothing. The Pope created the Jesuit order specifically to combat Protestantism and the spread of heresy. They received training in conversion and were unaccustomed to failure. Again, the Portuguese attempted to convince her of the error of the teachings of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. But, quote, "she argued with them, defeated them, and embarrassed them," end quote. Wlada Petros demonstrated superior intellect compared to the Jesuits, one of the most highly educated groups in the Roman Catholic Church. Her story depicted a woman resisting male authority with her own arguments and knowledge. The life of Wlada Petros underscored her intelligence through her interactions with the Jesuit priests in their failed attempts to convert her. Ethiopian men also questioned Wlada Petros' authority to teach and lead, but she proved that God enabled her to act where men had failed. Male ecclesiastical leaders became jealous of the crowds following her and asked, quote, "Is there a verse in Scripture that states that a woman, even though she is a woman, can become a religious leader and teacher? This is something that Scripture forbids to a woman," end quote. A respected monk came to her defense and replied, quote, "Did God not raise her up for our chastisement because we have become corrupt, so that God appointed her and gave our leadership role to her while dismissing us? For this reason, you will not be able to make her quit," end quote. Although other scholars view the monk's defense of Wlada Petros as a detriment to her agency, the monk still affirmed that her authority originated from God and placed her in a position superior to male religious leaders. Wlada Petros challenged the typical framework for understanding female saints by occupying a position of authority over men in the church as a result of her superior faith. The Book of the Saints of the Ethiopian Church and the life of Wlada Petros both demonstrated the religious power and authority available to Ethiopian Christian women. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church's unique theological and cultural position allowed it to develop a distinct attitude towards women in its writings. Medieval European hagiography of female saints in texts such as the Golden Legend emphasized the need for women to remain virgins and protect their purity at all costs. The Golden Legend included few representations of holy mothers or women exercising agency. On the other hand, the Book of the Saints, also compiled in the same medieval period, provided multiple roles for Christian women and depicted them exercising authority or remaining more steadfast in their faith than men. The life of Wlada Petros also presented a strong Ethiopian female saint who possessed significant power and authority in her words and actions, while resisting conversion to Roman Catholicism. Taken together, the female saints portrayed in the Book of the Saints of the Ethiopian Church and the life of Wlada Petros provided examples of women participating in Christianity in a wider variety of roles than the European hagiography recorded in the Golden Legend. The evidence from the Book of the Saints and the life of Wlada Petros challenges the dominant narrative about women and medieval Christianity. The emphasis on virginity as the best option for women was not a universal feature of Christianity, but rather a reflection of the anxieties of a particular time in Western Europe. Ethiopian Christianity allowed women to actively participate in their faith and exercise spiritual authority without denying their gender. This comparative analysis of the representations of female saints demonstrates the need to integrate medieval Christianity from other parts of the globe into the historiography rather than looking at each region separately. This type of research provides new insights and complicates our understanding of the development of the Christian faith. Thank you.